It was 5 in the morning on the 15th of August in the year 1231 when the first columns of dust appeared on the horizon. From the walls of the Kuju fortress, the sentries watched in horror as the dust turned into a dark tide covering the plain as far as the eye could see. 20,000 Mongol horsemen were advancing toward them. General Park Seo climbed the main tower and counted his forces. 300 soldiers, some armed peasants with whatever they had found, terrified women and children, refugees inside the walls. That was all he had to defend Kuju against the deadliest army the world had ever known. This is the true story of what happened when the impossible faced the inevitable. The Mongols knew no defeat. In 1231, under Ojeda, they had conquered more territory in 25 years than the Roman Empire in 400 years. China had fallen after decades of resistance. Persia, with its millennial fortified cities, had been swept off the map. Baghdad, Samarkand, Bukhara, names that once inspired respect, now just ashes and memories. Their strategy was brutal and effective. They arrived, demanded immediate surrender, and if the answer was no, they razed everything. No negotiation, no mercy, only two options: submit or die. General Sartak, commander of the Mongol forces in Korea, had an impeccable record. He had taken 15 fortresses in the last 3 months. None had resisted more than 2 days. Kuju would be number 16, and everyone knew it. The defenders themselves knew it. When Sartak sent his envoy demanding surrender, Park Seo gave a response that stunned the Mongol. "Tell your general to come and take what he can. We will not abandon these walls alive." It was a death sentence, military suicide, absolute madness. 300 men against 20,000 of the most feared warriors on the planet. The odds were not bad, they were non-existent. But what Sartak did not know, what no Mongol could know at that moment, was that Park Seo was no ordinary general. He had a plan. He had tactics the Mongols had never faced, and he had something more dangerous than any weapon. Men who had decided that dying on their feet was better than living on their knees. What happened in the next 30 days became the worst nightmare of the Mongol Empire in Korea. A siege that should have ended in hours turned into a month-long slaughter. A battle where each passing day cracked the Mongol legend of invincibility a little more. This is the chronicle of the Siege of Kuju, the story of how 300 men humiliated an empire, how innovation defeated brute force, how a handful of desperate defenders wrote one of the bloodiest pages in the history of Mongol conquest. If you want to discover how they achieved it, what tactics they used to repel wave after wave of attacks, and why this battle forever changed the way the Mongols viewed their enemies, like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to witness defies all military logic. Welcome to the day the perfect war machine broke against an unbreakable wall of will. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen in Kuju, we must first understand what the Mongol Empire really was in 1231. We are not talking about an ordinary army. We are talking about the most devastating military force that had ever set foot on Earth until then. Genghis Khan had died 4 years earlier, in 1227, but his legacy was more alive than ever. His son, Ogedei Khan, had assumed the throne of the largest empire the world had seen and had a single mission: to expand it even further. The numbers were terrifying. In just 25 years, the Mongols had conquered territories spanning from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean, more than 24 million square kilometers under a single banner. To put this in perspective, the Roman Empire, at its peak, took 400 years to conquer 5 million square kilometers. How did they achieve it? Their military system was revolutionary. Every Mongol soldier was an elite rider trained from the age of 3. They could fire arrows with deadly precision while galloping at full speed. They could cover 150 kilometers in a single day when other armies barely managed 30. They had a relay communication system that allowed them to transmit information across thousands of kilometers in days. But their deadliest weapon was not military, it was psychological: terror. When the Mongols approached a city, they sent envoys with a simple message: surrender now and live as subjects, or resist and be exterminated to the last man, woman, and child. It was not an empty threat. They always fulfilled it. Samarkand, one of the most beautiful cities in Persia, made the mistake of resisting in 1220. It had 100,000 inhabitants. When the Mongols finished, fewer than 50,000 remained. The city of Merv, with 500,000 people, practically ceased to exist. The Mongols did not just kill, they erased entire cities from the map as a warning to others. In 1231, this destruction machine had set its eyes on the Korean peninsula. The kingdom of Goryeo, which had existed for almost 300 years, was the next target. Ogedei Khan sent one of his best generals for the campaign, Sartak. Sartak was no ordinary commander. He was a veteran of the Chinese campaigns, where he had participated in the siege of fortresses considered impregnable. He had a reputation for being brutal but efficient. He wasted no time on prolonged sieges. If a fortress did not fall in the first days, he simply surrounded it, cut off all supplies, and waited for hunger to do its job. Then he entered and left no survivors as a lesson for others. He arrived in Korea with 20,000 of the empire's best horsemen. It was not the fully Mongol army, but it did not need to be. It was more than enough. In the first 3 months of the campaign, Sartak had taken 15 fortresses. Some surrendered without fighting. Others resisted 1 or 2 days before the walls were overcome. The average was 36 hours per fortress. The kingdom of Goryeo was on the verge of collapse. The king had fled to Gangwa Island, abandoning the mainland territory. City after city fell. The nobles surrendered one after another. Resistance seemed useless. The Mongols were unstoppable, and then they reached Kuju. The Kuju fortress was not particularly large, nor especially important from a strategic point of view. It was located in the south of the peninsula. It controlled some minor trade routes, but nothing that justified a prolonged siege. For Sartak, it should have been another quick victory on his list, but Kuju had something the other fortresses did not have: Park Seo. Park Seo was a middle-aged general, approximately 45 years old when the siege began. He did not come from a particularly powerful noble family. He had risen in the military ranks by his own merit, fighting in border skirmishes against bandits and pirates. He was not a famous strategist nor a known war hero. He was, in every sense, a common soldier who had become a general through competence and dedication. What made him different was his mind. Park Seo was an obsessive scholar of war. While other generals relied on traditional tactics, he read ancient military treatises, experimented with new formations, designed innovative siege weapons. His superiors often considered him eccentric, too theoretical, impractical. When the Mongols invaded, Park Seo received the order to defend Kuju with the available forces. It was not an order for victory, it was an order to delay the inevitable. No one expected him to resist more than a day or two. The hope was that while Kuju kept the Mongols busy, other more important fortresses could prepare their defenses or evacuate. Park Seo counted his resources: 300 trained soldiers, some veterans of minor skirmishes, but none had ever faced a real siege, much less against the Mongols. In addition, he had inside the walls approximately 2,000 civilian peasants who had fled from surrounding villages seeking protection. The walls of Kuju were 8 meters high, built in stone more than a century ago, solid, but not exceptional. The Mongols had overcome much higher walls. He had enough stored food for perhaps 3 weeks if strictly rationed. Water came from a well inside the fortress, which was an advantage, but limited. In terms of armament, the situation was precarious. Bows, arrows, some crossbows, swords, spears, nothing special. The Mongols had battering rams, catapults, siege towers, equipment that had brought down fortresses 10 times larger than Kuju. Any rational commander would have evaluated the situation and reached the obvious conclusion: defense was impossible. Surrender was the only logical option to save lives. Park Seo reached a different conclusion. He gathered his officers the night before the Mongols arrived. He told them something recorded in the Korean chronicles. Tomorrow we will see if 20,000 men who believe they have already won can defeat 300 who know they have nothing to lose. It was not bravado, it was cold calculation. Park Seo understood something fundamental about the Mongols. Their greatest strength was also their weakness. They were accustomed to winning quickly. Their strategy depended on speed and terror. But what happened when they encountered resistance that did not break? What happened when terror did not work? He was about to find out. When Sartak arrived with his 20,000 horsemen and saw the walls of Kuju, he smiled. This would be easy fortress number 16. He sent his envoy with the standard offer, surrender or death. Park Seo's response was clear and defiant. There would be no surrender, there would be war. On the 16th of August, 1231, at dawn, the 20,000 Mongol horsemen completely surrounded the Kuju fortress. From the walls, the defenders silently watched as they deployed in perfect formation, like a gigantic snake coiling around its prey. Sartak ordered the Mongol standards planted 300 meters from the walls. It was a clear message. This was Mongol territory. Now, whatever remained inside those stones was just a matter of time. The first Mongol tactic was not military, it was psychological. Throughout the first day, the horsemen simply circled the fortress, galloping in circles, shouting, banging their swords on their shields. The noise was deafening and constant. The dust raised by the horses covered the sky. It was a display of power designed to break morale before the first attack. Inside the walls, panic was palpable. Civilians cried. Some begged Park Seo to surrender, to negotiate, to do something to stop what was coming. Several young soldiers trembled visibly. They had never seen anything like it. No one had. Park Seo ordered silence. He gathered everyone in the central courtyard of the fortress soldiers. Civilians, elders, children, and spoke to them bluntly. The Mongols expect us to be afraid. They expect us to surrender. What they do not know is that we have already made our decision. We will not leave here alive if we fall. So we will make every hour they spend trying to take us cost them blood. We will make them remember this place. It was not an inspiring speech full of promises of victory. It was realistic, brutal, honest, and strangely, that calmed some. If they were going to die, at least it would be with dignity. On the second day, Sartak sent another envoy. This time the offer had changed. It was no longer surrender and live as subjects. Now it was surrender and we will only execute the military leaders. The civilians will live. It was a generous offer by Mongol standards, and he knew it. Park Seo did not even respond. He simply sent the envoy back empty-handed. Sartak understood the message. There would be no negotiation. He ordered preparations for the siege to begin. The Mongols were experts in siege warfare. They had perfected techniques during their campaigns in China and Persia. While Park Seo watched from the main tower, he saw them begin to build battering rams, mobile siege towers, and catapults. They had captured Chinese engineers who knew all the secrets of siege warfare. But Park Seo had also been preparing during the previous weeks. Before the Mongols arrived, he had implemented modifications to the defenses that his officers considered strange, even unnecessary. Now those modifications began to make sense. First, he had ordered deep trenches dug just behind the main walls. If the Mongols managed to breach, they would find another unexpected obstacle. Second, he had built elevated wooden platforms behind the walls where archers could reposition quickly. Third, and most important, he had gathered all the oil, tar, and flammable materials in the region. Park Seo divided his 300 soldiers into specialized groups: 100 archers, the best shooters available; 80 spearmen to defend the walls in hand-to-hand combat if the Mongols managed to scale them; 60 men assigned to operate the special defenses he had designed. The remaining 60 would be the mobile reserve, ready to reinforce any weak point. But his most valuable resource was not the soldiers, it was the civilians. Park Seo did something no other commander had attempted before. He armed the civilian population not to fight, but to sustain the war effort. Women were organized into production teams. Their job was to constantly manufacture arrows, turn any available metal into tips, sew bags for projectiles. The elders who could not fight took charge of rationing and distributing food and water. Children over 10 years old were assigned as messengers, running information between different sections of the wall. Everyone had a function. No one was idle. Park Seo understood that if he kept everyone busy, they would have less time to panic. He also implemented something revolutionary for the time: rotating shifts. While other commanders kept all soldiers on the walls during attacks exhausted and without rest, Park Seo established that only 1/3 of his forces would be in defensive position at any given time. The other 2/3 rested, ate, recovered. This meant his men would always be fresher than the enemy. On the third day, Sartak completed his preparations. He had 3 battering rams built, 2 mobile siege towers, and 6 catapults positioned. It was more than enough. He ordered one last message to Park Seo: "Tomorrow at dawn, the attack begins. This is your last chance. Open the gates, or we will tear them down." Park Seo gathered his commanders that night. He showed them the plans he had been designing. They were tactics no one had used before because no one had needed to be so desperately creative. He explained how they would use boiling oil not only when the Mongols scaled, but before, creating rivers of fire that would flow down the walls. He showed how he had modified the crossbows to fire multiple arrows simultaneously. He revealed that he had finished secret tunnels under certain sections of the wall not to escape, but to collapse specific areas if the Mongols managed to position themselves there. One of his officers asked, "General, even with all this, how are we going to survive against 20,000? Park Seo answered with brutal honesty, "We are not going to survive, but we are going to make them regret coming here. We are going to make every meter of these walls cost them 100 men. And when they finally enter, if they enter, they will find that nothing is easy to take." The 4th day dawned with thick fog. Through it, the defenders heard the sound that had terrified entire empires. The Mongol war drum, a constant, hypnotic, threatening rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. The catapults began to fire. Rocks the size of a man flew over the walls, crashing into the buildings inside the fortress. It was the prelude. The softening. Sartak wanted fear to do its job before his men attacked. Park Seo ordered all civilians to take refuge in the most solid stone buildings. He lost 15 people that first day of bombardment, civilians crushed by rocks that pierced roofs. It was a brutal reminder of what they faced. But he did not surrender. He did not break. At the end of the 4th day, when the bombardment ceased, Park Seo climbed the highest wall and looked toward the Mongol camp. He could see the campfires of 20,000 men stretching to the horizon, a sight that would have made any sane man flee. But Park Seo was not a sane man. He was a man who had decided that if he was going to he would drag as many enemies with him as possible. That night, he slept 3 hours. At dawn on the 5th day, the Mongols would launch their first real attack. And Park Seo was ready to show them that this fortress would be different from all they had conquered before. The storm was about to crash against the rock, and the rock had no intention of moving. The 5th day dawned without fog. The sky was clear, which was an advantage for the Mongols. They could see their targets perfectly. At 6 in the morning, Sartak ordered the first total assault. 3,000 dismounted horsemen advanced toward the walls in close formation, protected by shields. Behind them, the battering rams began to move, pushed by groups of 50 men each. The siege towers, with Mongol archers inside, rolled slowly toward the walls. Park Seo watched from his position. He did not give the order to fire, not yet. The Mongols reached 100 meters from the walls, then 80, then 60. Their archers began to fire, covering the sky with arrows. The defenders crouched behind the parapets. Some arrows found targets, wounding 7 Korean soldiers, 50 meters, 40 meters. Park Seo raised his hand. All the archers got into position, 30 meters. Now 100 bows tensed and fired simultaneously, but they did not fire randomly. Park Seo had trained his archers to aim at specific zones. The first 2 rows of Mongols fell instantly. It was not enough to stop them, but it disorganized them. Before they could react, a second wave of arrows hit them, then a third. Park Seo had established a rotating firing rhythm. While one group fired, another was already tensing their bows. It was a constant flow of projectiles. The Mongols continued advancing, reached the walls, began to place ladders. The battering rams struck the main gates with a thunderous sound heard throughout the fortress. It was then that Park Seo activated his first surprise. He had ordered channels built at the top of the walls, channels that led downward across the entire stone surface. When the Mongols began to climb, he ordered boiling oil poured into those channels. The oil did not just fall on the climbers, it flowed across the entire wall like rivers of liquid fire. The screams of the burned Mongols were deafening. Men fell from the ladders, dragging others with them. The smell of burned flesh filled the air. But the Mongols did not retreat. They never retreated. They kept sending more men. For every climber who fell, 2 more took his place. At the main gate, the battering ram kept pounding. Boom, boom, boom. The wood began to splinter. Park So had anticipated this. Behind the main gate, he had built a second gate reinforced with iron and stones. When the first gate finally gave way after 2 hours of constant pounding, the Mongols found a solid wall. Sartak's frustration was visible even from the walls. He ordered the attack intensified. The siege towers finally reached the walls. From the Mongol archers began firing directly at the defenders, killing 12 Korean soldiers in minutes. It was the first time the Mongols achieved a real foothold. Park Seo moved his reserve. 60 fresh men climbed the walls and attacked the towers with specially designed long spears. They did not try to destroy the towers, that was impossible. Instead, they pushed. The Mongol mobile towers were heavy but unstable. With coordinated effort, the defenders managed to topple one of them. The Mongol archers inside fell screaming, crushed by their own structure. The first attack lasted 4 hours. When Sartak finally ordered the retreat, the Mongols left more than 200 corpses around the walls. The defenders had lost 23 men. It was a small victory, but a victory at last. For the first time, the Mongols had not taken a fortress in the first assault, but Park Seo knew this was just beginning. On the 6th day, Sartak changed his strategy. No more massive frontal attacks. Instead, he implemented constant rotating attacks. He sent groups of 500 men every 2 hours. The goal was not to take the fortress immediately, but to exhaust the defenders, not give them time to rest. It was devastating. Park Seo's soldiers could not sleep, could not lower their guard. Every 2 hours, another wave of attackers for 3 consecutive days. This strategy worked perfectly. The defenders were exhausted, operating with barely 2 hours of sleep per day. Casualties accumulated not only from direct combat, but from exhaustion. Men who fell asleep at their posts and fell from the walls. Soldiers so tired they could not lift their bows properly. By the 8th day, Park Seo had lost 71 men. He had 229 operational soldiers left. The Mongols had lost approximately 800, but had 19,200 more. The math was brutal. That night, Park Seo made a radical decision. He gathered his commanders and told them, "We will no longer defend the entire wall. We will concentrate on 3 key points. The rest we will abandon." His officers protested. Abandoning sections of the wall meant allowing the Mongols to establish positions. It was contrary to all military logic. But Park Seo had calculated everything. By concentrating his forces on 3 fortified points, he could implement real rotations. His men could sleep, could recover, and when the Mongols tried to exploit the abandoned sections, they would find the traps he had prepared. On the 9th day, Pishawan, the Mongols noticed that certain sections of the wall were unprotected. Sartak ordered a concentrated attack on those areas. 500 Mongols climbed without resistance. They thought they had finally achieved a breach. They entered directly into a trap. Park Seo had mined those sections. When enough Mongols were inside, he detonated the rudimentary explosives he had prepared using gunpowder obtained from Chinese ceremonial rockets. The explosion was not massive, but it collapsed part of the inner wall, trapping the Mongols among rubble. Those who survived the explosion found themselves in an enclosed space, surrounded by Korean archers in elevated positions. It was a massacre. Of the 500 who entered, only 50 managed to retreat. This was the psychological turning point. The Mongols began to doubt. For the first time in years, they faced an enemy that not only resisted but outmaneuvered them tactically. Sartak was furious. He had lost more than 100 men in a week. This was unacceptable. He ordered more siege equipment brought from the base camp 50 kilometers away. He was going to raze Kuju completely. During the 10th and 11th days, there was a relative pause in the attacks. The Mongols bombarded constantly with catapults, but launched no ground assaults. They were regrouping, preparing for something bigger. Park Seo used this time wisely, repaired the damaged walls using rubble and wood, reorganized his defenses, and most important, spoke with his men. He reminded them why they fought not for glory, not for the king who had abandoned them. They fought because every day they resisted was one more day the Mongols were not conquering another Korean city. Every Mongol who died in Kuju was one less Mongol who would kill families in other villages. They were not heroes, they were an obstacle, but an obstacle that was working. On the 12th day, the new Mongol siege equipment arrived. Sartak now had 10 catapults and 5 new battering rams. He had received reinforcements, 2,000 fresh soldiers to replace the casualties. That night, Park Seo climbed the highest tower and observed the enemy camp. The campfires looked like stars in the darkness. There were so many. One of his captains approached and asked, "General, how much longer can we resist?" Park Seo did not lie, "I do not know. But every day we resist is a victory, and tomorrow we will give them the worst beating they have ever received." Because Park Seo had a plan of defense so bold, so risky, that it would change the course of the siege, and he was about to implement it. The 13th day dawned with thunder in the distance. A storm was approaching, but it would not be the only violent thing that arrived that day. Sartak had decided to end this once and for all. No more gradual tactics, no more testing the defenses, a massive and definitive assault. He ordered 8,000 men to attack simultaneously from all flanks. It was a force so overwhelming that no fortress the size of Kuju could resist. At 7 in the morning, the most intense catapult bombardment up to that moment began. For 2 hours, barrel-sized projectiles rained on the fortress. Buildings collapsed. Dust and smoke made it almost impossible to see. And then 8,000 Mongols attacked. They advanced toward the walls from all directions. The sound of their steps made the earth tremble. Ladders, siege towers, battering rams, everything moving at the same time. It was an apocalyptic vision. Park Seo had 221 operational soldiers against 8,000. The math was impossible, but he was not thinking about math. He was thinking about survival. He implemented the most radical tactic he had designed. Instead of distributing his men evenly across the walls, he concentrated 70% of his forces on a single point, the main gate. He left the rest of the walls practically unprotected, with barely a handful of archers. His officers thought he had lost his mind. He was inviting the Mongols to surround the fortress. But Park Seo knew something they did not know yet. The Mongols did exactly what he expected. Seeing the unprotected sections, they concentrated their forces there. Thousands of warriors scaled the eastern and southern walls with barely any resistance. In 30 minutes, they had control of a third of the fortifications. Sartak watched from his position with satisfaction. Finally, the fortress would fall. But then Park Seo activated his plan. The sections the Mongols had taken did not lead directly to the interior of the fortress. Park Seo had built secondary inner walls, creating a labyrinth of narrow corridors. The Mongols found themselves channeled into hallways barely 3 meters wide, where their superior numbers did not matter. And in those corridors, Park Seo had positioned armed civilians not to fight hand-to-hand. That would have been suicide. But on the roofs of adjacent buildings with simple instructions, drop stones, wooden beams, boiling oil, anything heavy on the Mongols trapped below. It was a slaughter. The Mongols could not maneuver. They could not use their formation tactics. They were trapped in tight spaces, being bombarded from above. For every Korean who fell, 5 Mongols died. The confusion was total. The Mongols began to retreat, but those coming behind kept pushing forward without knowing what was happening. They trampled each other. Some fell from the walls in the chaos. At the main gate, where Park Seo had concentrated his best troops, the 5 Mongol battering rams pounded simultaneously. The reinforced secondary gate began to give way. Cracks appeared in the wood and iron. Park Seo waited. Let them keep pounding. When the gate finally broke, the Mongols burst in mass. shouting victory. They entered directly into a corridor of death. Park Seo had built a funnel structure behind the gate. The Mongols who entered found themselves in a hallway barely 5 meters wide, with Korean archers on elevated platforms on both sides, protected by wooden barriers. Arrows rained from impossible angles to counterattack. The Mongols could not fire upward effectively while advancing in close formation. It was a systematic slaughter. For 3 hours, the Mongols kept pushing, sending more men into that deadly funnel, convinced that eventually the mass of warriors would overwhelm the defenses. But Park Seo had designed the system so that the bodies of the fallen blocked the advance of the next. The Mongols literally had to climb over mountains of their own dead. In the mid-afternoon, Sartak finally ordered the retreat. He could not believe it. He had sent 8,000 men, he had lost 1,000. The fortress still stood. The defenders had lost 47 soldiers and 89 civilians. Devastating numbers for such a small force. But they had survived the impossible. That night, Park Seo did not sleep. He walked the walls, observed his exhausted, wounded, traumatized men. Some cried, others simply stared into the void. They had seen things no human being should see. He had 174 soldiers left, approximately 1,800 civilians alive. Food supplies were running out. They had water, but arrows were scarce. He had used almost all his traps and improvised explosives, and the Mongols still had more than 16,000 men. Days 14 and 15 were relatively calm. The Mongols did not attack. They were reorganizing, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Sartak executed 3 of his commanders for incompetence. He needed a scapegoat for his failure. Park Seo used this time to repair what he could and reorganize the defenses, but he knew he could not repeat the same tactic. The Mongols would not fall twice for the same traps. On the 16th day, something changed. The Mongols began to build something different. They were not siege towers or battering rams. They were elevated platforms positioned out of reach of Korean arrows. Park Seo watched with concern. What were they planning? He found out on the 17th day, the platforms were bases for elite Mongol archers. From that elevated and protected position, they began a constant arrow bombardment. They were not trying to take the fortress. They were trying to make it impossible for the defenders to move. Any soldier who poked his head received a rain of arrows. The Mongols had learned, if they could not enter, they would make leaving impossible too. It was the beginning of a true siege. For 5 days, from the 17th to the 21st, this was the situation. The Mongols did not attack. They just fired constantly, without stopping. Park Seo lost 15 men to Mongol snipers. One of them was his second in command, Captain Lee, hit in the neck while coordinating the defenses. Food was running out. Rations reduced to 1 small meal per day. Children cried from hunger. Elders began to die, not from wounds, but from malnutrition and exhaustion. On the 22nd day, Park Seo gathered his remaining officers. Only 4 were left. He told them the brutal truth. We have provisions for 3 days. After that, we will have to decide between surrendering or starving to death. One of the captains suggested a desperate night attack trying to break the siege, even if only to allow some civilians to escape. Park Seo considered the idea. It was madness, but perhaps the only option. That night, while preparing the plan for the desperate attack, something unexpected happened. A Mongol soldier defected. He reached the walls under cover of darkness, shouting in Korean that he wanted to speak with Park Seo. He was a Korean who had been forced to join the Mongol army years earlier. He told Park Seo something crucial. The Mongol camp was divided. Many officers questioned Sartak. They had lost more than 3,000 men in 3 weeks. Mongol supplies were also running out because this siege was lasting much longer than planned. There were rumors that Ogedei Khan was sending messages asking why an insignificant fortress was taking so long. Sartak was under pressure. He needed a quick victory, or his reputation would be ruined. Park Seo understood immediately. The Mongols were as desperate as he was, perhaps more. He made the boldest decision of the entire siege. Instead of an attack to escape, he would launch an attack to inflict maximum possible damage. On the 23rd day, before dawn, Park Seo selected his 50 best remaining warriors, those who could still fight effectively. He gave them simple instructions. We are going out. We are going to attack their camp not to win, but to show them we can still bite. They opened a small side gate that the Mongols did not guard so intensely, confident that the defenders were too weak to counterattack. 50 men against a camp of thousands was absolute madness. But it worked. The Mongols did not expect an attack. They were caught off guard. The 50 Koreans entered like a knife into the camp, set fire to tents, destroyed supplies, killed dozens of sleeping Mongols, and before they could react, they retreated. They lost 12 men in the raid, but the psychological damage was immense. The Mongols, the conquerors of the world, had been attacked in their own camp by a force that was supposed to be dying of hunger inside the walls. Sartak was humiliated, furious, desperate, and Park Seo knew it. He knew that a desperate enemy makes mistakes. He just had to survive a little longer. Just a little longer. The raid on the 23rd day had changed everything, not in concrete military terms, but psychologically. The Mongols no longer saw Kuju as a simple fortress delaying the inevitable. Now they saw it as a personal affront, a humiliation that had to be erased with blood. Sartak called a war council that same night. His officers presented two options: continue the siege until hunger did its job, which could take weeks more, or launch a final massive assault using absolutely all available resources. Sartak chose the second option. His reputation could not withstand more delays. Ögedei Khan had already sent 3 messengers asking for progress. The Great Khan's patience was running out. He ordered all available soldiers except a minimal guard for the camp to participate in the next attack. They would be 15,000 men in a simultaneous assault from all flanks. No more elaborate tactics. Pure brute force. Overwhelm the defenses with impossible to resist numbers. On the 24th day, the preparations began. The defenders watched in horror as the entire Mongol army mobilized. They knew what was coming, the final blow. Park Seo had 162 operational soldiers. Many were wounded but could still fight. The civilians had been reduced to approximately 1,600. Hunger had killed almost 200 in the last week. He gathered everyone in the central courtyard, not just the soldiers, but every person capable of holding a weapon or throwing a stone. He spoke to them without artifice. Tomorrow they will all come. Nothing will remain after this attack. If we win, we will have achieved the impossible. If we lose, we will die knowing we made the most powerful army in the world bleed like never before. Each of you has shown more courage in these weeks than most people will show in their entire lives. It has been an honor to defend you. There were no battle cries, no promises of victory, just a solemn silence. Everyone knew it was probably their last night alive. Park Seo spent that night walking the walls, memorizing every face, every name he knew. He wanted to remember them if, by some miracle, he survived. The 25th day dawned with a blood-red sky. The elders said it was an omen. They were right. At 8 in the morning, 15,000 Mongols attacked simultaneously. There was no prior catapult bombardment, no psychological intimidation, just a human tsunami crashing against the walls from all directions. Ladders multiplied like a plague. For everyone the defenders knocked down, 3 more appeared. The boiling oil ran out in the first hour. The arrows ran out in the second. The defenders began to fight with swords, spears, stones, anything. The Mongols reached the top of the walls at multiple points. Hand-to-hand combat was brutal. Park Seo had distributed his best warriors in teams of 5, acting like firefighters running from one critical point to another, repelling the Mongols who managed to establish themselves. By noon, the Mongols had taken complete control of the eastern wall. It was the first time they achieved a sustainable foothold. They began to lower ladders into the interior of the fortress. Park Seo took his final reserve, barely 30 men, and personally led the counterattack. At 45 years old, he fought like a possessed man. The Korean chronicles record that he personally killed 7 Mongol warriors that day. He recovered the eastern wall but lost 18 of his 30 men in the process. The attack continued without pause for 14 hours. When the Mongols finally retreated at dusk, the walls of Kuju looked like a slaughterhouse. There was blood everywhere, bodies piled on both sides. Park Seo had lost 89 soldiers. He had 73 left. The Mongols had lost approximately 2,100 men. It was the worst slaughter of a single day in the entire siege. But the fortress still stood. Against all logic, against all odds, Kuju resisted. That night, something extraordinary happened. The survivors, both soldiers and civilians, did not cry, did not lament. There was a strange calm. They had survived hell. If they had resisted that, perhaps they could resist anything. Days 26 and 27 were of strange silence. The Mongols did not attack. They were exhausted, demoralized, confused. They had launched their best blow, and it had failed. In the Mongol camp, the division was real. Officers openly questioned Sartak. Some suggested lifting the siege and moving on. This fortress was not worth more Mongol blood. But Sartak refused. His pride did not allow him to withdraw. On the 28th day, a group of Mongol officers approached Sartak with a different proposal: poisoning the water. If they could not take the fortress by force, they would take it by slowly killing the defenders. Sartak accepted. The Mongols began throwing corpses of dead animals into the stream that fed Kuju's well. It was a dirty, desperate, but effective tactic. On the 29th day, the water inside the fortress began to have a strange smell. The situation was unsustainable. Without proper food, without clean water, with only 73 soldiers, Park Seo knew they were in the final hours. On the 30th day, something unexpected happened. An envoy arrived at the Mongol camp. He was not from Kuju, he was from the king of Goryeo, still sheltered on Gangwa Island. The message was clear. The king had agreed to pay annual tribute to the Mongols and recognize their supremacy if they withdrew their forces. Ojade Khan, tired of the Korean campaign that was costing too many resources, had accepted. The war had officially ended, but Sartak refused to lift the siege of Kuju. His personal honor was at stake. He could not return without having taken this fortress. He argued that he had to finish what he had started before withdrawing. Days 31 and 32 were of tense negotiations. The royal envoy insisted that the siege must be lifted immediately. Sartak demanded only 2 more days to take Kuju, inside the fortress. Park Seo knew nothing of this. He only saw that the attacks had ceased. He thought the Mongols were preparing an even greater final assault. He gathered his remaining 73 soldiers and told them, "If they attack tomorrow, it will be the end. We have no resources to resist, but we will die fighting. We will burn on our feet." The 33rd day dawned with thick fog. Park Seo and his men were on the walls, waiting for the attack they believed inevitable, but it did not come. Instead, at 10 in the morning, they saw something extraordinary. The Mongol camp was lifting its tents. They were withdrawing. Park Seo could not believe it. He thought it was a trap, but hour after hour they watched as the Mongols dismantled the camp, loaded their equipment, and began marching north. There were no ceremonies, no formal recognition of defeat. The Mongols simply left. Sartak had been forced by his own officers to obey Ogedei Khan's order. The humiliation of withdrawing without having taken Kuju would haunt him the rest of his career. But he had no choice. By noon today, the last Mongol had disappeared on the horizon. Park Seo remained on the walls for hours, unable to process what had just happened. His men surrounded him, some crying, others in shock. Park Seo looked at the shattered walls, the unburied bodies, the emaciated civilians, the wounded soldiers. He answered in a hoarse voice, "We survived." And sometimes that is the same as winning. 73 soldiers and 1,600 civilians, Eurasia had resisted 33 days against 20,000 Mongols. It was impossible, but it had happened. The news of the failure at Kujuya reached Karakoram, the capital of the Mongol Empire, 6 weeks after the lifting of the siege. The messenger who carried the report to Ogedei Khan knew he was bringing news no great Khan wanted to hear. Ogedei was reviewing maps of future conquests when he received the report. He read in silence, then read it again. Finally, he asked in a dangerously calm voice, "How many defenders did this fortress have?" "Approximately 300 at the start. Less than 100 at the end, and we lost how many men? More than 3,000 dead, almost 100 wounded. The silence that followed was terrifying for everyone present. Ojide Khan had inherited the largest empire in the world from his father, Genghis. He had continued the expansion with absolute success on all fronts until now. He did not execute the messenger as some expected. Instead, he summoned his most experienced generals and showed them the report. He asked them a simple question: how is this possible? The generals analyzed the situation for days, studied the tactics Park Seo had employed, the defensive innovations, the use of terrain. What they found worried them deeply. For the first time, an enemy had systematically analyzed Mongol tactics and developed effective countermeasures. Psychological intimidation strategies had not worked. Massive assaults had been channeled into kill zones. Traditional siege tactics had been neutralized with innovative defensive engineering. Kuju was not just a military defeat, it was a breach in the Mongol myth of invincibility. And myths, once broken, are hard to repair. Ojide made a decision that surprised many. Instead of severely punishing Sartak, he discreetly relieved him of command and assigned him to less prominent campaigns in the northern steppes. He wanted no additional publicity about the failure. The less talked about Kuju, the better. But he also ordered something more significant: that the defenses of Kuju be studied and specific tactics developed to overcome similar fortifications in the future. Mongol siege engineers received instructions to design equipment that could neutralize the innovations Park Seo had implemented. In Korea, the news of Kuju's resistance spread like wildfire. The king of Goryeo, who had negotiated peace from his island refuge, was in an awkward position. Park Seo had achieved what the monarch could not: make the Mongols bleed. Initially, Naum, the king, tried to minimize the event, fearing that celebrating the resistance might anger the Mongols and break the newly signed peace treaty, but the population did not allow it. Park Seo had become an instant popular hero. The general was summoned to the royal court 3 months after the siege. He traveled with the 73 soldiers who had survived to the end. He expected honors, recognition, perhaps an elevated position. What he received was more complex. The king granted him titles and lands, yes, but also ordered him to retire from active service immediately. The official reason was to rest after his heroic defense. The real reason was political. Park Seo was too popular, too independent, and the king did not trust generals who overshadowed his own authority. Park Seo accepted without protest. He had seen enough war. He retired to a small property in the south, where he lived another 18 years before dying in 1249. He never wrote his memoirs, never sought more glory. The details of the siege we know come from the records of his surviving officers and from the chronicles of the Goryeo dynasty. For the Mongols, Kuju became a costly but valuable lesson. In later campaigns against Japan and southern China, they implemented new siege tactics based on what they had learned from their failure. They developed more patient strategies, less dependent on massive assaults, more focused on cutting supplies and avoiding excessive casualties. Ironically, Park Seo's defenses made the Mongols better at siege warfare. Innovation always generates counter-innovation. In terms of psychological impact, Kuju had lasting consequences on the Korean peninsula. In the following decades, when the Mongols returned with new demands, they found a population less willing to submit immediately. Resistance seemed possible, now not easy, not probable, but possible. Small fortresses in other regions began to implement some of the defensive tactics Park Seo had used. Inner walls, channels for boiling oil, funnel designs behind main gates. Not all were successful, but Kuju's tactical legacy endured. Sartak never regained his prestige. He died in 1241 during a minor campaign in the Russian steppes without glory, without recognition. Mongol historians barely mention him. His legacy was being the general who failed where he should not have failed. The siege of Kuju cost approximately 3,200 Mongol casualties and 227 military defenders, plus nearly 600 Korean civilians. In purely numerical terms, the Mongols might have considered it acceptable, but in terms of time, resources, and lost prestige, it was a disaster. Because sometimes in war, it is not about who wins, it is about who can afford to lose. And the Mongols, accustomed to quick and cheap victories, discovered that there was a price too high even for the most powerful empire in the world. So, was the siege of Kuju the worst carnage the Mongols experienced in Korea? The answer is complex but definitive, yes. Not because the absolute figures were the highest of the entire Korean campaign, but because it represented something the Mongols rarely experience: a complete tactical defeat against a numerically inferior enemy. The Mongols lost battles before, lost soldiers in other campaigns. But Kuju was different because it challenged the fundamental logic of their military system. They were a machine designed for quick and crushing victories. Kuju gave them the opposite: a prolonged, bloody siege, and, in the end, a withdrawal without conquest. Why did the defenders win? 3 critical factors. First, exceptional leadership. Park Seo was not a legendary military genius, but he was something more valuable: an adaptable thinker. While other generals would have applied conventional tactics and expected conventional results, he constantly innovated. Every day he presented new challenges to the Mongols. He never allowed them to settle into a predictable pattern. Second, intelligent use of limited resources. Park Seo understood that he could not win with force, so he won with efficiency. He concentrated forces where it mattered, abandoned positions he could not hold, and turned every meter of the fortress into a potential trap. He did not try to defend everything. He tried to make taking anything unbearably costly. Third, the Mongols counted on fear and desperation breaking enemy morale. In Kuju, they found defenders who had decided that dying resisting was preferable to living subjugated. That mindset is impossible to defeat with mere military tactics. The lessons of Kuju transcend its time. In the 13th century, it demonstrated that great empires are not invincible when facing determination combined with innovation. In later wars, we see echoes of this same dynamic. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans temporarily stopped the Persian Empire. The Alamo. Military history is full of moments where numbers did not determine the outcome, where human wills hit, creativity under pressure, and inspired leadership overcame overwhelming material advantages. Park Seo teaches us something about leadership that remains relevant today. A leader does not need to promise victory to inspire his people. Sometimes what is needed is brutal honesty about reality, respect for those he leads, and the will to share every risk he asks them to take. Park Seo did not take refuge in a safe bunker. He fought on the walls with his men. That arrogance, even when backed by 20,000 elite warriors, can be defeated by 300 men with a better plan and nothing to lose. Park Seo's legacy endured in Korean memory for centuries. Today, almost 800 years later, his name remains synonymous with impossible resistance. The Kuju Fortress, though in ruins, is a protected historical site in South Korea. What does this tell us in our time? That facing impossible odds does not mean surrendering before starting. That innovation can level unequal playing fields. That collective determination can achieve what individual resources cannot. The story of the Siege of Kuju is the story of humanity in its rawest, deadliest, vulnerable, but extraordinarily resilient form when it finds a cause worth resisting for. 73 men against an empire, and the empire blinked first. If this story inspired you, leave your comment on which moment of the siege impacted you the most. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of impossible resistance that changed history. And remember, sometimes the greatest victory is not conquering, but simply refusing to be conquered. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most extraordinary sieges in military history.